I recently finished harvesting most of the winter squashes I grew this season, and I thought it might not be a bad idea to post a start to finish how-to video on the topic. So today, I'm going to cover winter squash, variety selection, sowing instructions, feeding and maintenance, troubleshooting, and how to know when it's time to harvest them. This video focuses on such winter squashes as butternut and acorn, but the methods outlined also work for pumpkins and summer squashes as well. In my climate, Zone 9B in the Sacramento Valley, squash and pumpkins can be a bit challenging to grow. Most years we just don't have all that much time between our last frost and the start of extreme heat. Extended periods of extremely hot weather, 90s and triple digits Fahrenheit, wreak havoc on squash pollination and fruit set. This can be a real problem for typical long vine habit squashes and pumpkins, which can take upwards of 110 days to produce mature fruits. We rarely have that much time between when the soil warms to the 70 or so degrees that is ideal for squash plants and when our extreme heat arrives. My solution to this problem is to grow bush habit and short vine squash, which typically mature in 70 to 90 days. A difference of 10 to 20 days to maturity might not seem like all that much on paper, but my experience is it can actually be make or break for squash. It can mean the plant will successfully set fruit in late May or early June when the temps are typically still reasonable, as opposed to late June or early July when heat waves start negatively affecting pollination and fruit set. Short vine and bush habit squash have an additional trait that's helpful to small space gardeners such as myself, in that they don't take over every inch of garden space I have or require large trellises to wrangle. Most of the varieties I grow can actually be considered container friendly, assuming it's a large container, say 24 inches wide and about as deep. One drawback to these compact squash varieties is they don't typically yield as much per plant as their space-hogging brethren, when conditions are ideal, that is. A bush habit squash plant in a raised bed or container simply isn't going to produce as much fruit as a plant that can sprawl 30 feet in the middle of a field somewhere. That said, conditions in my garden are rarely ideal. Since the longer production times of vining squashes make them more likely to be in the flowering phase as extreme heat arrives, their yields are more likely to be reduced by such conditions. In practice, I usually get a bigger harvest by growing many bush habit plants than I do by growing a long vine plant or two. Let's take a quick look at the bush and short vine habit squash varieties I grew during this most recent season. These here are golden nugget squash. The baseball to softball sized fruits resemble miniature pumpkins and are produced by fairly compact bush habit plants. The flesh is deep orange and very sweet, but the meat to waste ratio just isn't as good as with the other varieties I grew. Butterbush are a bush to short vine habit butternut squash variety that has become a permanent fixture in my summer gardens. Its vines will grow to about 3 feet in length, and they produce a surprisingly large amount of squash. As you'd expect, they taste identical to any other butternut squash. These odd-looking squash are a type of acorn squash called Thelma Sanders sweet potato. This was my longest vining variety of the season, with the vines stretching to about 6 feet. They're fairly heavy producers of fruits running in size from half a pound on the small end to over 3 pounds on the high end. As of this video's posting, the squash are still curing in my office, so I can't yet really comment on flavor. These here are a bush habit version of delicata squash. The plants were very compact and container friendly, but they just didn't produce all that much for me. As with the previously mentioned Thelma Sanders squash, I haven't yet had a chance to sample these, but delicata squash in general have a reputation as having exceptional flavor. Most gardeners don't start their squashes indoors due to their fast-growing nature, but since I'm always playing a game of beat the heat, I like to start mine under my grow lights 3 to 4 weeks before my anticipated transplant date. In my climate, this usually has me starting my squash sometime in the first 2 weeks of March, so I can get a fairly mature plant in the ground during the first half of April, once we're past frost danger and the upper layers of soil have begun to warm up a bit. Getting a 3 to 4 week jump on the season, again, might not seem worth the effort of starting squash indoors, but it can mean the plants have a better chance of setting fruit before the heat sterilizes the pollen. There really isn't all that much to starting squash indoors, but I do have a few tips. First, squash are sensitive to root disturbances, and prone to transplant shock, so they're one of the few plants I will start in biodegradable pots like you see here. I recommend using large, 4-inch or better pots, as squash grow quickly and will quickly overtake a 2 to 3-inch pot. When it comes time to transplant, you just plant the entire pot. Attempting to extract a plant from a biodegradable pot will probably kill the plant. Now I'm moving away from peat pots and more towards paper-based biodegradable pots like these from Back to the Roots. The paper pots actually decompose quickly in the ground and don't act as an obstacle for the roots. Now, sowing itself is super easy. You just fill a pot with your preferred seed starting mix and plant the seed about a 1/2 inch deep. As an optional step, you can lightly sand the edge of the seed prior to planting to help the seed hole fall away a little easier after germination. To accommodate germination rates that might be less than 100%, I recommend sowing 2 to 3 seeds in the same pot. After all 3 germinate and emerge, you thin down to whichever one looks like the healthiest and strongest seedling. After that, it's really just a matter of keeping your starter pots under grow lights or in a location that gets strong, even sunlight. Keep the seed starting medium adequately damp but not sopping wet. This can actually be a bit of a challenge in biodegradable starter pots, which seem prone to both drying out quickly and soaking up water like a sponge. There is a learning curve to watering biodegradable pots properly. Most squash seedlings will emerge in 7 to 10 days. Once you see the first true leaves emerging, you can begin sun hardening, which involves gradually exposing the seedlings to real sunlight so they don't burn to a crisp when you plant them out in your garden. Start with about a 1/2 hour of sun exposure and then maybe add 10 to 15 minutes extra each day. When the started plant looks about like this, it's time for it to go in the garden. You'll notice this one is not planted in a biodegradable starter pot. That's because I didn't intend for this squash to actually produce. This was just something I started to smoke out any potential herbicide contamination in some new mulch and soil that I had recently bought. I'm really just using this as a visual example of what a started squash seedling should look like about when you put it in the garden. Squash are heavy feeders and thrive in soil that is rich in organic matter. They'll often thrive in soil with an abundance of compost that hasn't even fully decomposed yet. So it's not uncommon to see vibrant and productive squash and pumpkin plants growing out of manure piles and compost heaps. Since my gardens are not compost heaps and manure piles, I do periodically fertilize them with a soil drench made from a general purpose fertilizer. Something like a fish emulsion fertilizer is good for this, as is a Miracle-Gro type of fertilizer, as long as it's not applied excessively. And since potassium is crucial to good fruit development, I will also begin a monthly application of a soil drench made from potassium sulfate like this once I start seeing female flowers developing on the vine. About 1 to 2 tablespoons of potassium sulfate per gallon of water does the trick. Now, if you live in a hot and sunny climate like I do, I highly recommend shade cloth over your squash plants. This does wonders to reduce plant stress and will almost completely eliminate the tendency of squash plants to wilt in the midday sun. While squash are fairly low maintenance crops, needing little more than adequate water and a little fertilizer, they are unfortunately pest magnets. While I'm very lucky that squash vine borers haven't yet arrived in Northern California, and those who have to deal with those things have my deepest sympathies, my squash plants are typically plagued by 3 pests: slugs, whiteflies, and squash bugs. I found that small slugs like this little guy here, and actually smaller, did the most damage to my plants, as they would chew off the very tips of newly emerging leaf nodes and flower buds, effectively pruning the plants and stalling their growth. Now, in terms of control, I've found that iron phosphate-based slug baits, such as this Sluggo here, are the most effective method. While this product is harmless to anything with a spine, I have read some studies that suggest it might actually be harmful to earthworms, which, as we know, are a very vital part of soil ecology. So with this in mind, I'll likely change my application methods in the future to ensure I'm not inadvertently mixing any into my soil and potentially wiping out my earthworm population. The second pest in my axis of evil when it comes to squash plants are whiteflies. While they're tiny, their collective efforts can absolutely wreak havoc on squashes. Their feeding directly damages and stresses plants, and they can transmit numerous, often lethal diseases. One of the telltale symptoms of whitefly damage to squash plants is the silvering of the leaves, which is a reaction to a toxic substance in whitefly saliva. That, and of course the clouds that are kicked up when you jostle the plants a bit. While certain companion plants such as French marigold and nasturtium are said to repel whiteflies, these haven't been very effective for me. The best control method I have found so far is an insecticidal soap, and after diluting the soap in accordance with the label, you just spray the solution on the undersides of the leaves to help knock down whitefly populations to levels that allow plants to still thrive and produce. Now, insecticidal soap provides a contact kill only with no residual effects, but it can be harmful to bees and other pollinators, so apply only in the evening after the bees have gone to bed. Now, the final pest I typically have to deal with are squash bugs. These are a bit tough to deal with as their exoskeletons make them resistant to most organic gardening approved pest control products. I've found that diatomaceous earth can help control the nymphs a bit, but for the most part, physical removal is the only recourse, a task made extra nasty by the foul-smelling substance they emit as a defense mechanism. It's also possible to remove the squash bug eggs, seen here, before they hatch by scraping them off the undersides of leaves. Realistically, though, you're probably not going to be able to remove enough eggs or adults to really beat them back in any meaningful way. Luckily, I find that squash bugs don't really accumulate in large numbers until late in the season, when my squash have nearly matured and are almost ready for harvest. That's another reason to start squash early and stick to quick yielding varieties. Lack of pollination can, of course, result in female flowers shriveling up and falling off before they can develop and mature. Now, if a plant has a good number of both male and female flowers and there's a decent level of pollinator activity in the area, pollination shouldn't really be much of a problem. Unfortunately, sometimes plants are a bit difficult. I ran into a situation early in the season where a number of my squash plants had an abundance of female flowers but a complete lack of male flowers. Luckily, I was able to find a workaround. These Thelmasander squash plants here are of the species Cucurbita pepo. In May, they were producing a lot of female flowers, but there wasn't a single male flower in sight. Luckily, my zucchini plants and delicata squash plants, which are also of the species Cucurbita pepo, were producing plenty of male flowers. So I was able to pluck male flowers from the zucchini and delicata plants and use those to cross-pollinate my Thelmasander's plants. Since all three squash varieties are members of the same species, this works. The current generation of fruits will be true to type, but plants grown from their seeds will be a hybrid that may or may not be desirable, so seed savers beware. I do have a more detailed video on cross-pollinating squash in my channel history, if anyone happens to be interested. Assuming the worst hasn't happened, at some point after transplant, eventually it will be time to harvest your squash. Ideally, a squash should exhibit the following traits before you harvest. It should be the color it's supposed to be when it's ripe. The rind should not be easily gouged by your fingernail, and the stem should be hard, dry, and brittle. Squash that are mostly ripe, say 85% of the way there or better, will continue to ripen off the vine, so I say if your fruits are almost to peak ripeness and are being ravaged by pests, or if a frost is imminent, go ahead and harvest a little early. For best flavor, I like to let my squash cure for about a month before eating them. Most winter squash will keep at room temperature for at least several months, with some varieties lasting a year or better. Now, let's take a quick look at my winter squash harvest totals for this season. My 4 golden nugget plants gave me a total of 12 pounds for an average of 3 pounds per plant. The 5 bush delicata plants I had going yielded a total of 13 pounds for an average of 2.4 pounds per plant. My 3 Thelmasander sweet potato plants produced a total of 20.5 pounds for an average of just under 7 pounds per plant. And finally, 6 of my butterbush plants yielded 33 pounds for an average of 5.5 pounds per plant. And as I post this video, I still have another 6 plants with maturing fruits that aren't quite ready for harvest. I'm estimating these will yield maybe another 10 to 15 pounds of squash total. Altogether, I now have 78 pounds of winter squash curing indoors. Once I harvest the stragglers, I'm guessing I'll have a final total of between 88 and 93 pounds, which is a little shy of my squash goal of 100 pounds, but still not that bad all said and done. After this season, I'm likely going to cut my weakest producers from my rotation to make room for the heavier producers, as well as allow space to grow a few experimental varieties. I'm fairly confident that next year I can improve yields even more by being a little more proactive in terms of pest damage prevention in the early season. And finally, if anybody knows of any interesting bush habit or short vine winter squash varieties that I didn't cover here, I'd love to hear all about them in the comments. So until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.